In 1999, director John Lasseter joined forces with Tom Hanks and Tim Allen to give the world an epic sequel to cinema's most beloved Band of Toys.
In 2021, we returned to a familiar brand at only 93 proof.
The film is Toy Story 2.
The whiskey is Old Forester 1910.
And we'll review them both. This is
The Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are once again, Brad, returning to the year 1999 to look at, just a phenomenal movie in Toy Story 2.
It's not fair! How can you do this to us?
Hey, look, I'm sorry, but this is all a big mistake. You see, I was in this yard sale.
Yard sale? Why were you in a yard sale if you have an owner?
Well, I wasn't supposed to be there. I was trying to save another toy.
Was it because you're damaged? Did this Andy break you?
Yeah, but no. It was an accident.
Sounds like he really loves you.
It's not like that, okay? And I'm not going to any museum.
Well, I'm not going back in this storage.
Bob, the wildness that it is that, you know, for the most part in this podcast, we don't go on to sequels. And there's a reason for that, right? Like, most sequels, how do I put this delicately, Bob? They kind of blow.
There is a significant drop-off from number one to number two, usually.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Pirates of the Caribbean, you look at The Matrix, you look at all sorts of things, and you start off at a high point, and then companies say, I want more money, make more of that. And, you get not as good second, third, fourth movies. However, in the case of Pixar, that is not true. Well, it is true, but that's Cars 2. In the case of Toy Story, we have one of the greatest sequels of all time.
Oh, yeah.
Am I wrong?
No, not at all. Brad, I think one of the interesting things for me today is going to be trying to parse out why I love Toy Story 2 versus why I love Toy Story 3, because for the longest time, I always said Toy Story 2 is the best of the bunch. And then I actually watched them all through in like the span of a week or so last summer, and Toy Story 3 really hit me. And I think what I'm going to come down on, Brad, just, right up front here is I think Toy Story 3 might be the better quote unquote film, but I think Toy Story 2 is the better movie. Toy Story 2, I think, maybe more than any other Pixar movie, finds that really delicate balance of things that are super deep for adults and things that will actually keep your children entertained. And I think as Pixar has kind of gone on through the years, they have lost some of that childlike silliness that used to accompany some of their movies. Like when I watched the movie Soul last, winter, it was a fine movie and I enjoyed it, but like, there's no way that my 4-year-old is ever going to be like, let's watch Soul again. And Toy Story 2 is like revisiting this golden time in Pixar's history where they were truly firing on all cylinders, not just making movies for adults to go cry at, but, bringing in really silly kid stuff too. And it all works perfectly.
At the end of the day, Toy Story 2 is brilliant because I literally found myself laughing out loud at probably 20 different moments of the movie, and it's only an hour and a half long movie. So like 20 different points, I'm just like laughing my butt off. I mean, they have some of the funniest lines I've ever seen in an animated film. And in addition to that, the story that they're telling about the loss of childhood is incredibly impactful.
Mm-hmm.
And you have Sarah McLachlan singing, and you're just crying your eyes out because it's like a prequel to Up.
Yeah.
Like, it's phenomenal. I think, yeah, I'm excited to get into it, Bob.
Me too, man. And just to kind of tack on to that, Toy Story 3, for me, as a grown-up, like they made it at a certain point. I think they came out in 2010. So they knew that their original audience had grown up and was in Andy's shoes at that point. Like they were all in college. And I think that movie is very, very impactful for people, who grew up as 90s kids or just for adults in general. And when I think, though, about like the ones that stick with me the most, That's why I keep going back to Toy Story 2. Like, there are, I'd say, 3 movies in a row that Pixar will just never achieve those heights again. And it was Toy Story 2, followed by Monsters, Inc., followed by Finding Nemo. Those 3 movies just kind of hit that special Pixar alchemy. Do you know what I mean? Of really, really entertaining for even the smallest child and also incredibly engaging for adults. So we're going to get into talking about this. I cannot wait. But before we get too far down the road here, we need to introduce America's favorite segment, Brad Explains. This is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the movie he has just seen, often for the first time. I think it's pretty safe to say this was not your first time seeing Toy Story 2.
Yeah, no, Bob, I feel like this season in general, I feel like I've seen a lot more of these movies. I'm pretty proud of myself.
I'm proud of you too, man. But that also means that we're holding you to a higher standard here. If you've seen Toy Story 2, then you should be able to break down the plot of this movie in less than 1 minute, correct?
Oh, 100%. This is simple. Simple stuff.
Let's do it, man.
In Toy Story 2, we find Woody stolen by a toy collector. Buzz and a few of the gang set out to rescue him. They have adventures in a toy store and crossing roads. Meanwhile, Woody finds out that he is actually a part of an old cartoon show called Woody's Roundup, and that he completes this set of like vintage dolls that were used in the show, and they're going to be sold to a museum in Japan. And so you find Woody struggling with identity, and does he belong to Andy, or should he go to this museum and be seen by children? And he is rescued by Buzz and the gang and decides to go with them. And along the way, he brings his friends Jesse and Bullseye. And Stinky Pete is stinky, and he sucks. Boom.
Truly, the stinkiest of Pete's.
The stinkiest of Pete's. Toy Story 2, the end.
You did it, man. Yeah, I mean, it really is, again, it's a simple story, as these movies really should be. It shouldn't be higher concept than, hey, these toys can come to life and talk. And yet, they're really fleshing out like the mythology or the philosophy of like what's going on with these toys and how they're grappling with this idea of becoming obsolete. We're going to get into all that. I really do think this movie goes very deep, Brad. But I want to spend the first part of our episode just going over the basics, the enjoyable, lighthearted nature of this movie, talking about the performances, talking about, the movie making stuff at play here. So, we've done Toy Story 1 on this podcast already. We will be doing Toy Story 3 at some point. I can assure you we will not be doing Toy Story 4 because every time I revisit the first 3 Toy Story movies, I am reminded of truly how much I hate Toy Story 4 and how much it just ruined like everything they tried to build up to that point. But I digress. Brad, when you compare this movie to Toy Story 1, like what immediately stands out to you here?
I think that this movie is just more polished.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can tell that they've had 4 more years of animating experience, and while the humans are still terrifying, it's on a little bit lesser of a scale. Like they're slightly more proportioned and less scary.
Yeah.
But the big thing for me is that there's a clarity of story in this movie where you know exactly where these characters are going. I love that they don't try to put some wedge between Buzz and Woody. And obviously the big thing is like, will Woody go back with them? But I don't even think of that as like a wedge between Woody and his friends. It's more of just an identity crisis for Woody. Mm-hmm. So like, it's not like they're trying to retread the same water of Buzz and Woody trying to fight for Andy's affections. It's like, nope, we did that in the last movie. And in the first 5 minutes of this movie, we see like, no, like Andy loves both of them. He plays with both of them. And it moves on to a new crisis.
Yeah.
And so I think the story in this movie is just so well done. And then like seeing Buzz and his gang of toys trying to find their way through the city, and like they just keep running up against obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, which just gives them fun ways to illustrate how toys would navigate in the real world. I just think that they took the idea of Toy Story, expanded it, and gave us just this phenomenal rendering of what would happen if toys came to life in our world.
Yep. The very first note that I took is that I love how in the Toy Story universe, each movie gets a more and more elaborate opening sequence. So in this one, you've got Buzz Lightyear, the character, flying through space and invading this planet to defeat the evil Emperor Zurg. And there's this, incredible shootout, and Buzz and Zurg are fighting, and then Buzz turns around and Zurg just blows him in half. And I really loved the fake out of you just watched one of your favorite characters get incinerated on screen. And then it kind of cuts back and you see that they're actually playing a video game, and it was Rex. And because he can't reach the buttons, he always gets killed by Zurg. But that fake out was so funny. And I'm watching the movie last night with my 4-year-old who has seen the movie before, but just doesn't remember that part. And I looked over at his face when Buzz got blown up, and he was so confused. It was so funny to watch that on his face because he had no idea what was going on. Like, he just watched Buzz Lightyear die. And then, 5 seconds later, they reveal that it was just a video game. But I love that they were kind of gutsy enough to start their movie with that kind of a fake out. And it's that attitude that I feel like is kind of being lost in more contemporary Pixar stuff. Like, this movie never feels like it's playing it safe. And I don't know if they would start a movie with that kind of opening in 2021. It just doesn't seem like something, like it seems like the kind of opening that someone will get on Twitter after they watch it and complain and say that their child was traumatized or whatever. And back in 99, it was just like, no, we're going to try these silly things. We're going to see what sticks. And I just kind of appreciate that they were still in an era where they were willing to take those chances.
Well, and I think it's something that resonates with the kids watching the movie. Like, all of us have played different, video games on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo and had those bosses that we just couldn't beat. And so in that little moment, we're like, oh, like, I can resonate with, with Rex as he's trying to beat the final boss of this game. I don't know. I just remember as a kid, that opening was the coolest thing in the world.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you got to see Buzz in action. You found out that it was a video. Like, there's just something about that I just remember thinking as, like, 9-year-old Brad, that was literally, like, the most phenomenally awesome things.
Well, and going back to your point about the way that the animation improved just in 4 years from 95 to 99, one thing that I have always really appreciated about Pixar is their attention to detail. And I don't just mean like in making things look realistic, but it's filling out the corners of things, the corners of rooms with detail and making something in every shot that if your eye kind of wanders, you're still rewarded with something. And I think that makes up for the lack of reality in the human characters. Like, they still, like you said, look a little bit terrifying. But there were moments in this movie where I'm thinking, oh, yeah, they actually put the effort and the energy into, like in that opening scene with Buzz Lightyear, when he's landing on Zurg's planet, his jetpack has fire coming out of it. And when he kind of swings around to come down to the ground, the fire kind of swings the way that it would if it was hitting different kinds of, air currents. Yep. It's tiny little things like that. At the end of the movie, when, Woody is trying to save Jesse and he throws his drawstring and they, lasso themselves around the plane's wheel and they land on Bullseye. And the next shot is the shot of the plane taking off. But if you look in the corner of the shot, like, you can see Woody's pull string going back into his back the whole length of that shot. And it's the kind of thing that, like, they didn't need to animate that. They could have just cut to a shot where that thing was already back in Woody's back. But they took the time and the energy to animate those things. And I think that is, even in 99, it was setting the standard for, like, what a Pixar movie would be. They were going to be the animation studio that paid attention to those little details. And I think it really makes for a much more rewarding experience.
For me, the shot that, like, was a rewarding attention to detail thing was the dust on the top shelf where Wheezy was found. Like, the way that you could see where Woody had, like, moved and disturbed the dust, and then there was areas where it was still, like, unsettled. On the side of Woody's face was some dust from being thrown up there. It's those little minute details that you're just like, oh my gosh, like, Pixar is miles ahead of the competition, especially when you look at a contemporary movie. Like, I think Shrek came out in 2000, a year later. And like the animation it just is years behind what Pixar was doing.
Well, and then you have things like when Woody is watching the Woody's Roundup reruns on TV, they so accurately recreate what a 1950s television show looks like. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever seen one of those old shows, like an old variety show, because a lot of times they were broadcast live on TV. And there's just something about 1950s TV cameras. The lensing is very weird. It makes everything look a little bit distorted. And they were able to recreate that perfectly. It just had, like you said, there's an attention to detail here that I don't even think was necessarily present in the first one. And you can just tell that they devoted the extra time in this one.
Well, and I'm curious, with all this attention to the animation detail and such, the other part of Pixar movies that are so phenomenal, I think, are the voice acting performances, right? That you have so many people who do a lot of Pixar movies, but, their main characters are switched in and out. How do you feel about Tim Allen and Tom Hanks and the supporting cast in this? Was there anybody that stood out to you? Where did the voice acting performances in this film sit as opposed to maybe the first one?
I think this is the one where they really figured out exactly what each character's kind of role to play was going to be. Like, Woody is always going to pull the emotional weight of the story. And Buzz might have a scene or two where he really has to get emotional, or, when he's talking with Woody about, why won't you come back to Andy's house? Why do you want to be behind glass for all time?
I don't have a choice, Buzz. This is my only chance.
To do what, Woody? Watch kids from behind glass and never be loved again? Some life.
Tim Allen does a great job there, but part of the thing that makes people laugh about Buzz Lightyear is that he is this kind of, ignorant. I don't even want to say ignorant, like brash, but like he has this delusion of being a space ranger. And so when the new Buzz gets opened and kind of infiltrates the group and they think he's gone back to acting like the old Buzz Lightyear, it's really funny. And I think that's where Tim Allen shines, is in that sort of over the top, hard-headed, I am a space ranger thing. And they let Tom Hanks pull the emotional weight of going through this incredible existential crisis. And I think the same thing can be said for like some of the supporting roles. I think Kelsey Grammer is really good in this as Stinky Pete. Honestly, I think that Wayne Knight is the perfect choice for Al from Al's Toy Barn. And as I'm watching this, like, that dude is at an 11 out of 10 the entire movie. He's taking his character from Space Jam and amplifying it by 14 for this movie. I wish I had a shot of him in the recording booth doing this movie, because it had to seem so over the top to everybody watching it, but it's absolutely necessary for that character. He is so amped to finally have this, complete set and be able to sell it to these people in Japan. Honestly, his performance kind of stood out from among the rest because of just the sheer level of energy he was bringing.
Yeah, I felt like it was in Jurassic Park when he's meeting with this, secret agent guy, and he starts shouting his name in the village. And he's like, nobody cares. You're fine. Like, it felt like he took that energy and just blasted it throughout the entire movie. Bob, I'm right there with you. I think Wayne Knight was utterly spectacular in this movie. I mean, his performance as Al, it's endearing and yet revolting, and you just couldn't get enough of him in this movie. Like when he's complaining about driving all the way to work and you see him pull out and drive across the street and park at Al's Toy Barn. I mean, just everything about him is over the top, and it's brilliant.
On the flip side, Brad, and I don't know if you're going to join me in this endeavor, but my hottest of hot takes, I've never been a huge fan of Joan Cusack's voice as the voice of Jessie. And that's not to say that she does a bad job, and that's not to say Jessie's a bad character. In fact, I think Jessie is such a home run character that they probably could have gotten almost anybody to be her voice and we would have gone along with it. And I hate to say that about Joan Cusack, because she does bring the energy and she does a really good job playing the whole range of emotions that Jessie has. But there's just something about her voice. And, I just looked up her IMDb. She was born in New York City, but she has a very Midwestern almost like a Minnesota sounding voice. There's just something about that Midwest accent on a cowgirl doll that it never has fully clicked for me. It's just always been a little bit jarring. And even through her being in 3 movies now, I've never really gotten used to it.
So are you saying that she could have taken over for Frances McDormand in Fargo?
They should have made Jessie actually be a Marge Gunderson doll instead of a cowgirl.
a pregnant police
With a cup of coffee in her hand.
with a cup of coffee.
Oh, man.
Bob, I'm actually right there with you. I think that Joan Cusack is a really good actress, but I also feel like her voice sounds like she's just chewing. Like do you remember as a kid, and like we're talking about the 90s a lot today. If you were a kid in the 90s and you wanted to chew bubble gum, what type of bubble gum would you get, Bob?
Well, if I was going to go true 90s, I would go with bubble tape. Do you remember?
Yes,
Do you remember?
So that works for what I'm talking about,
right.
but what's the other option? Big League Chew.
Oh, yeah.
So Big League Chew, it came and it looked like chewing tobacco.
Yep.
And you could just stuff as much of it in the back of your mouth as you wanted. To me, it sounds like she just unrolled like half of the thing of bubble tape or took like half of the pouch of Big League Chew, shoves it in the back of her mouth, and then tries to act. Like every performance I've ever seen her in, it just sounds like she's chewing on a big old wad of bubble gum.
That's really funny.
And it just kills me a little bit inside.
You know what? I'm reading her IMDb now. She was born in New York, but she was raised in Evanston, Illinois, so right outside of Chicago. And then she went to college in Wisconsin. So that makes a lot of sense. I don't know, but like, do you get what I'm talking about? I don't think she's bad by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm so used to it being her voice now that I can't really imagine. Like if you said, well, who would you replace her with? I don't know who I would have chosen. It's just always, you know, like when you look at Woody and you hear Tom Hanks's voice, it's like a nicely fitting piece of clothing. Like it just goes together. That one always seems to have an extra step of like suspension of disbelief for me. And I get used to it, but it's just never felt as married together as Tim Allen or Tom Hanks with their characters.
No, I totally agree. And even like with Kelsey Grammer with Stinky Pete, like his voice is literally perfect for Stinky Pete. And so with Jessie, I'm right there with you, Bob. I don't know if it's a hot take or not that we're both saying this, but I don't love Joan Cusack as Jessie. And it's unfair because I think she brings the energy and the vibrancy that character needs. Like, you know, you were talking about Wayne Knight in the recording booth. Like, I would bet you any money Joan Cusack was animated and jumping around that booth and yeehawing her way on through Jessie's lines. But there's just something about her voice I just don't like. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
And there it is. Brad, if I could shift gears just for a second here. One thing that I really noticed when we were watching this movie this time through, I think Pixar always had a really good sense of where to put the quote unquote camera. You know what I mean? Like there was some really inventive shots in the first Toy Story, but it always felt very like utilitarian. It was very much like, what can we accomplish with this shot? What are we trying to do? And we got the shot that we needed. It was very workmanlike. And there were very few shots in the movie that I thought were just there to be very artistic. There were a couple, but this one, I think they really took the leap from just having serviceable camera angles and shots to having ones that looked very cinematic. And I noticed it a lot that they were doing this kind of shallow focus thing where everything in the background was out of focus. So like when Woody is first going to leave the hotel room and he opens up the gate, the vent, the grate there, and they shoot him from inside the grate, and you just see him holding it up with his 2 hands as Kelsey Grammer tries to convince him not to. Everything in the background is out of focus, and it looks like, wow, they filmed this with a real camera. It's like an incredible shot. And there's 3 or 4 shots like that in this movie. But even some of the more, like I said, serviceable or workmanlike shots, like when Zurg first pops up out of his box at Al's Toy Barn, and they show him watching Buzz Lightyear run across the parking lot. And they have this really cool inventive idea of, hey, what if he was one of those toys that had like a look here thing in the back? And the camera goes from outside of his head to inside of his head, and you're seeing it through Zurg's eyes. there's just so many really, really inventive, clever shots in this movie. I thought it really was a step up from what we saw in part one.
Well, like I said earlier, it's 4 years later. Like, you see that Pixar has developed as an animation studio. They have more experience. This isn't their first rodeo, if you will.
Hey-o.
The stuff that they are doing in this movie, for me, when the elevator comes up and Zurg is on top of the elevator and, fake Buzz jumps into action, shots like that just felt amazing. There's a lot of beauty in this second movie that you're right, Bob. It wasn't quite there in the first one as much. I'm curious, though, how do you feel about certain shots, like when they're in the car and they have Rex, running up behind them, and it's a clear, homage to Jurassic Park. Like, there's a few of those throughout this movie. They reference Star Wars. They reference Jurassic Park. Like, how do those feel to you in this movie? Because I feel like those things irk you in other movies that we've talked about.
Yeah, those things always do irk me. When you make mention or you make reference to another movie and there's really no payoff or there's no reason for it, it's just to make a reference. I think those things bother me because it's like you're using somebody else's work to make a cheap joke where the audience goes, I know that. And that's the extent of it. And I think
do you think that they got a copyright notice violation?
Yeah, I guess Disney didn't own Star Wars at that point, so maybe they did. Who knows? But you know what? Honestly, though, for the most part, I think that this movie does a really good job of kind of balancing out some of those pop culture references. So the most obvious one, like you said, there's the one from Jurassic Park where Rex is running, and I did kind of hate that because there was no callback to it at any point. It was just like, hey, remember Jurassic Park? But the I am your father thing with Buzz Lightyear, I actually thought that worked really well because Buzz Lightyear is so clearly sharing like the mythology of Star Wars that it just kind of made sense to make that reference. And I also appreciated that the scene didn't end there. It ends with Rex knocking him off the elevator. And then you see that like new Buzz has done a complete 180 already. And as he watches his father fall to his death, he just reaches his hand out.
Father, no.
And that's the payoff. So I actually liked that reference because they did something with it. And that's kind of where I'm at with this whole movie. Like, I think a lesser movie would take some of these setups and not pay them off. Like, I was really, really impressed with the fact that, at one point they're driving around with tour guide Barbie in Al's Toy Barn and they knock over that whole thing of bouncy balls. And you think it's just a little throwaway thing. It comes back like 5 minutes later when the real Buzz is trying to tail Al out of Al's Toy Barn. He trips over all those balls. So, like, they establish things and then they make sure that they come back at some point. Even at the end of the movie when they have to hijack, the Pizza Planet truck and they pull out of the parking lot, they run into the traffic cones that they were using to get across the street earlier in the movie. They're still there. So I really like that for the most part, they don't just set up these scenes or these moments for the sake of having a cheap laugh. They make sure to like remind you of them later on in the movie.
Well, and the other thing I like is, you just mentioned the pizza truck there. I love that they are self-referential. Like, they have references from the first movie, but they're not overwhelming. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, there's a pizza truck from Pizza Planet. Like, I remember Pizza Planet. I've been there. That's like a different part of the Toy Story world-building mythology. And so as soon as you see that pizza truck, you think about the first movie a little bit, but they don't overdo it. They don't like drive you into it as if, you it's like, hey, remember Pizza Planet? It's just, nope, quick reference, moving on, and you're good to go. I like that they do that in this one because I think a lot of, especially animated sequels, they just rely so daggone heavily on the former's material that it just gets old. I mean, it feels like The Force Awakens and anything else that J.J. Abrams does.
Mm-hmm. Brad, before we go to break, I just want to briefly talk about the most satisfying scene in the history of movies when the old man comes and fixes Woody. And I just honestly wish that they had made that be in like, 1/2 speed and we could have just watched that in slow motion because there is just something so inherently satisfying about watching him like polish Woody's little eyeballs and stuff. I don't know, man.
I-
Am I just a weirdo, or was that scene just like incredibly satisfying to watch?
I mean, it's the internet, so you can find like thousands of other weirdos like you out there that enjoy that scene. I like that scene. I think it's a well-made scene. I do think that if you like put the visual up online with like Swan Lake playing in the background, people would lose their mind. But yeah, no, I really love that scene. The big thing for me was the fact that it's the guy from the chess game,
the
Pixar
little short film. Yep.
And when he opens up the middle of box of his thing, when he's looking for his glasses, you see all the chess pieces in it.
There it is.
See?
Yeah.
The little things like that. I'm just like, oh yeah, good job, Pixar.
I am a weirdo about that stuff, though. Like, all of my YouTube recommendations are videos of a guy getting like an old rusty meat cleaver and restoring it, or there's this account I follow on YouTube. I think they're from Poland. They're a rug cleaning company, and they just film themselves like cleaning these incredibly dirty rugs, and it's like a 20-minute video, and then at the end you're like, whoa, look how clean that rug is. I don't know, man. I'm just a sucker for things being meticulously cleaned.
Yeah, I like I said, Bob, there is a Reddit page out there for you.
Oh, man. All right, Brad, what do you say we hit pause here? Let's try this Old Forester 1910.
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Old Forester 1910. Brad, I feel like we've been on a bit of an Old Forester kick lately. We've been bringing Jackie Zykan on the show, and I mean, for good reason. She's wonderful. I have a confession to make here, though. I have never, ever tried Old Forester 1910, and it's because people often compare it to the Old Forester 1920. So it's part of this series of whiskeys that Old Forester makes called the Whiskey Row series, which consists of their 1870 original batch, the 1897 bottled and bond, this 1910 that we're drinking today, and then the one that's called 1920 Prohibition Style. Now, we've tried that 1920. I think it's one of the best values you can get at $60 or under in bourbon. And so people have always said, you got to try the 1910, but I keep seeing, like, for the most part, people say the 1910's good, but it's not as good as the 1920. And so every time I've had an opportunity to buy a bottle of the 1910, I just say no and buy 1920 instead. So I'm really, really excited to try this, Brad. Have you ever sampled the 1910 before?
I have not. I was really excited to see this in here. You're right, Bob. We've been drinking a lot of Old Forester lately, and I've just been impressed at pretty much every single turn. I think what Jackie and her team are doing over there is spectacular, and I can't get enough of it.
Yeah, so this one is very different from the 1920, though, because it only clocks in at 93 proof. What they do is they take fully matured Old Forester bourbon, and then they put it in a second barrel, which has been lightly toasted and then also heavily charred. Jackie is on record saying that the second barrel that this goes into is charred almost to the point of incineration. So apparently it picks up a lot more character in that second barrel. So this is kind of similar to what we're seeing with some toasted barrel finishes, but then they also char the barrel. It's you know, if we could be crude about it, it's like Old Forester double oaked. And I am very excited because it's bottled at almost the same proof as Woodford Reserve double oaked. It comes from Brown-Forman, so I'm expecting them to share a little bit in common here. Let's get to it, man. What are you picking up on the nose of this 1910?
Man, Bob, this nose is just beautifully smooth. It's got a lot of vanilla. There's a smattering of like nuttiness and caramel. It's a little bit creamy. I'm really impressed with this nose. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm loving this, man. It has pretty much everything you'd want from a bourbon and then some. There's a lot of nice oak notes here, but not like super heavy, fresh lumber. Like it definitely smells like a toasted wood or a smoked wood kind of a thing. It has some caramel to it, you're right. But for me, it's heavy on the baking spices. There's a lot of cinnamon here. I get a lot of green apple on this, and then I also get some floral notes as well. So it goes from being dark and sweet to really bright and fruity and vibrant. Brad, I'm kind of in love with this nose. I'm hoping that the rest of the experience can be as good as this, because I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the nose.
Yeah, and as I get into the palate here, Bob, this is really, really good. Like this is like creamy caramel. It mixes with oak. For me, I'm getting a little bit of like a hazelnut kind of flavor to it. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but the biggest thing that I can say is it is one of the smoothest and yet most robust flavors I've ever had on a whiskey. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10.
I can see where this is a cousin to Woodford Reserve, but honestly what this reminds me more of is Blanton's. It's the same proof point as Blanton's. It's not as harsh as that one single barrel we had, but I think this is where some of the more kind of bitter oaky notes come through for me. It is not incredibly sweet. I don't get any of that green apple that I had on the nose. So I really like it, but it is a step down for me from the nose. I'm only going to give it a 7.5 on the flavor.
And as I get into the finish here, I just think, once again, I'm sticking with my guns here on how smooth it is. It's a really nice finish. It's got those soft notes of hazelnut and caramel. There's a little bit of oakiness there. I wish that the finish lasted a little bit longer. I think that that's one of the few places where it falls short, but the fact that the finish tastes so beautiful and I want it to last longer is honestly a good thing in itself. I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the finish.
Yeah, I like the finish here. I think that it actually packs a punch for being only 93 proof. It's not harsh, it's not aggressive, but it definitely lets you know it's there on the way down. Again, I like it, but I don't think it lives up to the heights of what I had in that nose. So I'm going to give it a 7.5 again on the finish. And that takes us to overall balance. This is where we consider nose, taste, and finish as one kind of cohesive experience. For me, Brad, there was definitely like a big step down from the nose to the taste and finish. It wasn't like a bad experience. It was just that there was so much complexity on the nose, and the taste and the finish were just not nearly as complex. It was just much more oak forward to me. I still think it's pretty well balanced, but I did come away a little disappointed. I'm going to give it, once again, a 7.5 on the balance.
Yeah, I think you live in a silly land with silly thoughts, Bob. This is a superb whiskey that is incredibly well balanced. From start to finish, I feel like this is one of the smoothest whiskeys with some of the best flavor I've ever had. I think the 93 proof point is absolutely perfect for what they're offering here. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10 on balance.
Wow, 9.5. Man, I think
dude,
we found one of your favorite whiskeys here, Brad.
Yeah, I am just blown away with this 1910. And as I get into the value, we're talking about $55 for this bottle in the state of Ohio. So for me, as I look at the value here, I think that this is a phenomenal value. It's not perfect. If this bottle was at like $40 or $45, I think it would be a 10 out of 10 value. But at $55, there's other stuff in this range that is solid, but I wouldn't say quite as good as this 1910. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on value.
Yeah, I don't think it's a terrible value at 56, but when you can get 1920 for essentially the same price, I see why people are saying that one's just a better whiskey. I like this at this proof point. Like you said, if it was even like $45, I'd probably give it a higher score. I'm just going to give it a 6 on the value. And so that's taking me out to a 37.5 out of 50. Brad, what are you coming out to?
A 43 out of 50.
Wow. All right, so that's taking us to an 80.5 out of 100 or a 40.25 out of 50. This has reached that 40 mark for us, which is really, really hard to attain. Guys, again, I think this is a really good whiskey. I don't quite think it's as spectacular as Brad does, but this is a no-brainer recommendation.
Yeah, this is an easy one. Go out and buy a bottle for yourself. go get a glass at the bar. Any place that you can find some 1910, I think it is well worth it. It's really, really good.
All right, before we get out of here on the whiskey, Brad, I do want to ask you, comparing this to Woodford Double Oaked, because again, they're both Brown-Forman products, essentially, I think it's a pretty good comparison from a rough point of view. Do you prefer the actual whiskey here to Woodford Double Oaked, or like which one would you choose?
Oh man, I think I would choose the 1910.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I love the Double Oaked. I honestly, I would need to do them in a blind and really see which one stands out to me more.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, like, compare them based on their value too, but the price of Double Oaked keeps going up. So actually in Ohio now, Woodford Double Oaked costs $52, and this one costs $56. So it's really not like you're saving very much to get a bottle of Double Oaked either.
Yeah, I mean, with the price point being, essentially the same, you're paying $7 or $8 more. Mm-hmm. I'm really enjoying this 1910. It might be a recency bias, but I'll choose it for now.
All right, so there it is, folks. Old Forester 1910. 2 big thumbs up from both me and Brad. I recommend trying. I recommend buying. Brad, what do you say we get back into talking about Toy Story 2?
Let's get to it.
All right, that was Old Forester 1910. We are getting back into talking about Toy Story 2, a movie that, if we can be frank, we both just freaking love.
Yeah, I sat down to watch this movie, and within minutes, I was laughing my butt off.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a film that is purely funny, and not just funny, but pure. This is just a lighthearted, caring movie. There's nothing dirty or raunchy about it. They don't have to rely on super raunchy jokes to make the adults laugh. Half of the humor in this movie, I think children can understand and still find funny.
Yeah.
And so Bob, I'm in. I'm sold on this movie.
But see, I think what's going on beneath the surface too is what really makes this stand out as not just an entertaining movie, but I honestly think that you could not over dissect this movie. I think you could devote hours and hours to talking about what the philosophy of this movie is, what's going on beneath the surface. And so, Brad, let's just take a couple minutes here. I do want to talk about the themes of the movie. I want to analyze it a little bit. Are you ready to go deep on Toy Story 2?
Bro, let's get to it, man. I am so excited.
So, when I'm watching this movie, I think that even from the very beginning of the film, they are setting out their kind of thesis statement that what they're going to be dealing with this time around is the idea of obsolescence, the idea that you feel like you are becoming obsolete, that you are being outgrown by the world around you, that you're going to be replaced by something. And, that very early dream sequence that Woody has where Andy's just throwing him in a garbage can and saying, I don't want to play with you anymore. It seems weird at the beginning of the movie because you can't quite tell what kind of tone we're going to establish here. But I think it's really, really crucial. And the thing that I love about the Toy Story films is, number 3, I think sometimes catches a lot of crap from people because they say that it's too much for grown-ups and not enough for kids. But when you look at the kind of arc of the 3 Toy Story movies, I think they do a really good job of not just escalating the stakes, but making the stakes that the characters are dealing with be kind of the next logical step from the movie before. So when we did Toy Story 1, we talked about how the major theme of that movie is this realization that you are not, in fact, the center of the universe, right? This was Buzz's big story that he realizes he is not a space ranger. And in fact, not only is he not a space ranger, he is a child's plaything. He is a really bad facsimile of a space ranger. But the thing undergirding that is Woody's story, that he's also realizing he's not the center of the universe. He has this inflated sense of who he is and his self-importance, and they both come to realize, like, I may not be who I think I was. I may not be as important as I think I was, but that I can still find purpose in life by serving something bigger than myself, which in that case is Andy. And so, like, you know, Brad, just as a spoiler and a disclaimer, I think that, like, as pastors, you and I both recognize that there is, like, a really explicit, like, theological thing going on here in the Toy Story movies too. And, you know, we just came off of doing Les Mis, so we talked about the gospel a bunch, but I see in the Toy Story movies a really, really logical kind of laying out of this idea of the gospel, of recognizing that you as an individual have been going one way in life and really making yourself the center of the universe, and coming to realize, not only am I not the center of the universe, I am something that falls far short of being the center of the universe. And in order to find purpose, I have to be able to let go of my own ego and become something else. And so I think that's where number one leaves off. And number two, I think, really kind of comes in with this idea of, all right, what's the next logical step in that journey into yourself? And it's like bucking against that call to subject yourself to something, to be, you know, a servant of Andy. Like, Woody is really dealing with, I only have a limited window of being loved by this kid, and I don't know that I want to subject myself to that. And that's really the struggle that we see Woody dealing with here. And I think, you know, again, that carries over into the third movie. But just as we kind of get started going deep on this here, Brad, I think that what I love about the Toy Story movies is that the main question or the main crisis that the characters deal with really does seem to be a logical step from movie to movie.
Well, it's a question of relevance, right? Like, will I be relevant 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And really, like, I feel like this is a question that will resonate with people in their 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Right? Like, when you look at, I think it's Piaget's stages of life, or maybe it's Erickson that talks about the different questions that we're asking at different stages of life. When you look at the later stages of life, they are looking at, like, was I relevant? Was I important? Did I do things in this world that were worth remembering? Like, will people remember me? And, you know, it comes back to relevance. And I think that that's kind of what Woody is facing, is this movement towards, in the lifespan of a toy, Woody is passing through middle age and getting closer to, you know, being an elderly statesman, if you will, in the world of toys. When we view that as humans, when we think about, man, what was my life? What did it add up to? What was the purpose of my life? I think that's a really scary thought to think, especially when you're hitting your 30s and 40s, you're getting into your careers. And if you're willing to take a step back and say, you know, what is the trajectory of my life leading towards? You know, I've made all of these decisions leading up to who I am in this moment. Let's look far ahead. Let's double my lifespan. Let's look at, you know, I'm 30 now. Let's say I live to be 90. Where is this going to take me? Am I going to be relevant? Am I going to be worth remembering? These are all questions that are important for humans to think about. And Bob, you're right. I think that Christianity has a lot of great opportunities to think about those questions and to examine them from a different lens than the one that culture tells us is the right way to think about things.
Well, and I think even a different lens to look at it, and this is one that I've seen a lot when we talk about the Toy Story movies, is that Toy Story is essentially like an extended metaphor for being a parent. That the way that the toys react to Andy in the movie, in any of the movies, is actually a metaphor for how parenting is. And I actually think that's a really good way of looking at it too, because, you know, it's different than the one we've been talking about. But like in this movie in particular, you have this idea of Woody fearing that, you know, his kid, Andy, is going to outgrow him soon. And I think that's a fear that all parents go through. Like my kids are very, very young, and I'm already starting to kind of mourn the loss of, you know, them being toddlers and them being small children and growing into being bigger children. That's a fear that all parents have. And so for me at least, when I watch the Toy Story movies, I think that a really good way to try to identify what the theme of the movie is to kind of look at who are they setting up as the villain of this movie and what does the villain want? Because the opposite of what the villain want is what the movie is trying to like champion. You know what I mean? So in the first movie, you know, you might be tempted to say the villain is Sid, but Sid really doesn't play that big of a factor in the first movie. And the first film's villain in a lot of ways is actually Woody. Like Woody is his own worst enemy. He is causing havoc and being stubborn and being arrogant. And he comes to understand that the solution to those problems is in identifying like, I am not as important as I think I am. And in this movie, like the obvious villain is Stinky Pete the prospector. And Brad, I think it's so funny that we're like doing deep analysis on a movie where I have to talk about Stinky Pete the prospector. That's the main villain of the movie. But like when you look at the prospector, what he wants is immortality, and he'll get it at all costs. And for him, it's worth being behind glass forever just so that he can remain relevant. And when you look at it through that lens of like how parents sometimes try to, I think, stay in the lives of their kids for way too long in a way that is like false and sterile and like it just doesn't ring true. And I think that's why you have Buzz come into the scene later on and say, Woody, like what kind of future is that for you? To be behind glass, like never actually being loved again? And so the central kind of conceit of this movie is like, is it better to force this like ongoing relationship with no love there? Or is it better to have a finite, like limited amount of time with somebody, knowing that there will be a loving relationship there, even if that means it has to end at some point? And so I think that like when you look at it through the lens of parenthood, it really is about finding like healthy coping strategies for the fact that like we all get older and our relationships change. And I think there's a lot to say about that in this movie.
Dude, you're throwing me back. I am thinking about The Great Divorce, written by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And without going like crazy into detail, there's a section of the book that talks about this woman who is desperately searching for her child. And her child has moved on and gone away. And she just keeps talking about like, well, if I could just have him back and like help him find the right way, then he would be better off and he would be good to go. And this friend of theirs is trying to tell her like, no, like your love did not help him in any way. It smothered him. It kept him from growing up. And I think what that does is it points out that even motherly love, which anybody in the world would say like, oh, that motherly love is a virtue. It's a good thing. It can never be bad for a mother to love their child. I think that what the book does, and I think what you are pointing out here in Toy Story 2, is the fact that any sort of human activity, when it is not given over to a greater being of any sort, it can be corrupted and it can be broken. And the parents' desire to keep their kids from danger, you know, to keep, if we're using the Toy Story 2 analogy, to keep them from being smudged and worn and thrown around by children, from their arms being ripped off, from dirt being on, you know, getting onto their cheeks and stuff. Like, if we're so concerned about outward looks and we're so concerned with like preserving what we have in our 3-year-old and our 5-year-old and our 10-year-old, then we're going to lose out on where they're at right now because of the worry and the fear and the anxiety of them growing up.
Well, and it's the same thing with like this false idea of preserving ourselves past our own expiration date. It's, you know, like you see people that just desperately cling to the fact that I was good looking when I was young. And so I'm going to like have all these injections and get all these surgeries and do all these things to try to like give the false impression that I am younger than I am. And I think that this movie, like for being a children's movie about plastic toys, has so much to say about the idea that if you really want to truly have a healthy perspective, you have to come to terms with the fact that like we all have an expiration date. And whether that's literally in terms of, you know, confronting our own mortality, or it's just this idea that like the things that I liked when I was a kid are no longer considered cool. And instead of being like the creepy guy at the party that is trying to like act 15 years younger than I am, I'm okay with the fact that the things I like are obsolete now. There's a healthy sense of understanding. My time here is limited. And, to quote Woody at the end of the movie, it's going to be fun while it lasts. I think there's a really beautiful moment in this movie where Woody's introduced to this concept of the Woody's Roundup TV show. And then they all start kind of playing around and they're running on a record player. And talk about a visual representation for being completely obsolete now. Like, they're having fun, but the thing they're having fun with is even something that no one uses anymore. And again, this was like in 99 before all the hipsters started, returning to vinyl. But but I think it's a great little visual metaphor to show Woody's time is up, and he would be deluding himself like the prospector if he thinks that like kids 50 years from now are going to care at all about this 1950s Woody's Roundup doll. And at the end of the day, it's better to have the next 5, 6, 10 years with Andy than it is to try to like manufacture this fake prolonged relevance that I think people search for.
Yeah, I mean, if he had gone off to this Japanese museum, Toy Story 3 would have just been like a time speeded up shot of him becoming more and more dusty and less children looking at him in the museum until he gets packed away in storage.
And that's why I love Toy Story 3, because I think it takes the next logical step, into fleshing out the mythology of this series. And we'll get around to that one, whenever Toy Story 3 comes up. But I think what I love so much about Toy Story 2 is that it takes all the good things from number 1. It expands the universe. It asks really deep questions. Brad, I think that there is just kind of no way to get around the fact that my final score on this movie is going to be a 10 out of 10.
Yeah, it's hard for this is just such a hard movie to give a score to because Yeah, Bob, I'm with you. 10 out of 10. I can't see an animated film topping what they've done here in Toy Story 2 as far as a sequel goes. Like, there's other animated films out there that are phenomenal. Most of them are made by Pixar. But I think that they just stepped up in every way from Toy Story 1. Mm-hmm. And the first Toy Story was already a phenomenal movie. Yeah. So, easy. 10 out of 10.
We didn't even get to talk about the fact that, like, the production of this movie it had so many pitfalls. Like, at one point, this was going to be a direct-to-video movie, and then they started to see the dailies come in, and it looked like low grade, and then John Lasseter said, absolutely not, we're going to make this for real. And then at some point, somebody accidentally deleted all the files in the movie, and they just happened to have a backup that was like 80% of the way there. People worked 100-hour weeks to try to get this movie out on time. Like, the fact this movie got made at all is a minor miracle. And to have a movie that asks questions as deep as this one, it's mind-blowing to me that this is the product that we came out with and not just some kind of cash-grabby, crappy, inferior sequel. I will say again, Brad, I think number 3 might actually be the better movie, but the only reason that movie is able to ask the deep questions and go as, existential as it does is because it has 2 prior movies to rely on. So, like, in a lot of ways, Toy Story 2 is pulling the weight for Toy Story 3 to go even further. And it's hard for me to, like, parse out 1 versus 2 versus 3 because they really are such a cohesive experience. And again, Toy Story 4 doesn't exist, and it can go burn in hell.
Well, I mean, so I've never seen Toy Story 4. I'm not going to watch it. I will say the other thing going for Toy Story 3 is the 10-year gap. Mm-hmm. Like, Toy Story 1 feels appropriate for, like, a 5 to 7-year-old. Toy Story 2 feels appropriate for, like, a 9 to 11-year-old. And Toy Story 3 feels appropriate for, like, a 19 to 21-year-old. Yeah. That watched the first 2 when he was 5 to 7 and 9 to 11. Like, I don't know how they did it, but they just captured an entire generation of youth with the perfect movies and the perfect cadence of releasing them. And they were asking questions that were important to those generations as they were growing up. You'll never see another franchise, live action or animated, do what they did with this series.
But at the end of the day, we want to know what you think. Where do you stand on Toy Story 2 in the canon of Toy Story movies? Is it the best one? Is it your least favorite one? We want you to reach out to us and let us know. You can find us on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, @FilmWhiskey.
Or you can leave us a voicemail. Let your voice be heard on the Film and Whiskey podcast. You can call us on our website, which is anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
Next week, once again, Brad, in true Film and Whiskey fashion, we are taking a hard turn into a completely different subject matter. We're going to be looking at Paul Thomas Anderson's 2007 masterpiece, There Will Be Blood. So join us for that one next week. Until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.